Well, hello there. Thank you for joining me today. I woke up and I thought, you know what? I have a lot to be thankful for. Old Tom the Zionist really helped me a great deal in a very odd way with this psyops. Some of you may remember my early days on the internet. I even did a show about it when I was sure enough. I sure had enough time on my hands, and I waited to do a show about it until, years had passed, and I was sure enough time had passed that they couldn't nab me for breaking into John Ramsey's computer back during the John Benet Ramsey case. That was the first big murder case online. So yesterday, talking about Black Hat Conference and the tech deal brought back a lot of memories. I kind of fancy myself a junior hacker. Back then, hacking was a thing. Even I got into the game. I was thinking last night, the Black Hat Conference, that would have been one I would have attended. Even though I spent my career around trade shows, there were a few that I would attend just for fun, like the Consumer Electronics Show they held every year in Las Vegas. And, I remember back then how crazy everyone got when they found out that I'd been involved in hacking into John Ramsey's computer servers. Back in the old days, you only got one email address, and I was able to trick the tricksters, so the rest is history. And of all the things to fear, keep this in mind. We have front row seats to the biggest circus battle and challenge of this time on the game board. We get to witness the good versus evil battle, and who will win? It's both a terrifying, inducing event and one that can prove to be quite interesting. I think we're heading into kind of like what I would describe as the Olympics of the game board. Americans have been too comfortable for too long. Many people envy people in this country. There's a lot of this message, though, that they're missing, which I hope to get back to fill in later. What people aren't understanding is this is an experiment. It is an illusion that people in this country are doing well. We're basically being held together by toothpicks. Most people have been experimented on. Most people don't even remember or know. I will hopefully be getting back with a lot more information about that to put those pieces together. My father was in the military. There were 3 of us kids. Well, 2 of us were experimented on. What drove all of that? Well, so people are talking about, those boomers, they're horrible people. Well, I'm of the boomer generation, and maybe if we all tried to understand each other a little better, we might get along a little better at the end days here. People say things like, well, my boomer parents will never have anything to do with our kids. They're incommunicado. Well, do you realize a couple of things? Us boomers, our parents, as a general rule, did not speak to us. Yes, we were told things like little pictures have big ears, so they would stop talking when we were in the room. So boomers are kind of an interesting lot of folks, and I believe the boomer generation was a generation that got the highest level of actually on-hands experimentation, full stop. We've got all those people that rode in on those orphan trains that I now know came out of the Russia area. Yeah, remember those orphan train kids? Those came from the Caucasians, and that last stand they took just happened to be right there in Russia, right where Ukraine is. That was where those boats took off. So yeah, they took their last stand there. Those boats took off, and most of them came here. All those kids were let loose without parents and stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of reason why people in these different generations appear to have a few ticky-ticks wrong going on their heads because of all the suppression and all the omissions, right? And that comfort really bred an exceptionalist mindset. It actually, in a lot of ways, I think, made us much easier to manipulate. And when I come back with this other show, I mean, we were raised in an era that, do you realize, like from 1951, I was born in 51, but I was raised during the era when they played these duck duck shows where they were like teaching kiddos to duck from possible bomb threats. And there were things like, well, here's when you need to duck, kids, even when the adults aren't around. So yeah, there's a lot of trickery that's gone into this whole thing that's really encompassed all of us. So my suggestion is maybe until we know more, we take a very gentle approach with each other. Because, we got started with this exceptional mindset, and then it really got kicked with that manifest destiny, as if this land was ours for the taking, no matter who lived here before. And there was always a way to justify it, right? From the very beginning, we've carried an optimism bias that whispers, it can't happen here, but it can, and it already has. The days of tricking people out of land, of chaos and turmoil as tools of empire are no longer a side note of history. They are woven into the very fabric of our entire nation. It started with a robbery. This game board is coming to an end. The only question is, who wins? Us or the elites? They built a satanic nation where God was always a code word for something darker. And while others in history stood tall and fought and bled with courage, today, truth itself is trampled more easily than ever before. People do not align with other people. They're carrying the water for the Illuminatis. Whenever you discount somebody else in your own, let's say, class group, because that's all we really have to work with, right? Well, you're essentially carrying the water for the other people. So always keep that in mind in all of our interactions. America is not immune. It will fall. Just like every empire, they've written this script over, right? They wrote these history books, right? His story. Of course, they had to write in all these things about empires that fall before us because the plan is this empire is falling. The Rubicon has already been crossed and it lies far behind us. No one had the right to enslave us all, yet here we sit. They wrote the rules, designed the laws to entrap us. So we have been here all along. So why are we still so silent? In today's show, I'm going to be covering a lot of things that are coming together with my work. For years, I've been following the trail of imposters to figure out who they are. And it really started with me when I was working in Silicon Valley. I got into that tussle with Intel, and I had to sue them. And the way that it all went made me really question, who are these people? So who are these high-tech types? Who are the Romanovs? The Gypsy clan that dressed themselves as kings, priests, and generals. Who are they? Exactly who are they? And I've got some interesting timelines that I've been able to pull together. They've come through different eras. They've worn different costumes. They've worn different masks. But always, and I mean always, were the same killers behind the mask. And that was the Gypsies. So welcome to the Romanovs, the silent war, fire, fear, and the nuclear myth. Tonight we're going to take away the disguises, follow the fire, and see how this same clan continues its war into our present and what that exactly means for us right now. So the first thing I did was I started pulling together because yesterday's show, we landed on the fact that the 1600s, right? Well, I've been working around that 1400 time frame. And I've also been training ChatGPT all this time. What I've been doing is I give them all of my show notes for every show. So now all of my information is stored there, so it's actually quite good to be able to create these timelines and stuff. But a word of caution, ChatGPT is another huge lie, okay? It is only a more advanced database, okay? That is all that it is. It makes a ton of mistakes. It would be impossible to sit somebody down and say, okay, you figure this out, because as you're going along, it removes your data here and there. It does all kinds of things. But if you manage it properly, it's a wonderful tool. So let's get going here. So we really start off around what we're looking at. We also have the white factor involved here, right? Because we had the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, and all those people wearing their wigs and their jewels around the 1600s. Around that same time, the printing press, and the Bible, the mass circulation of that. And at the same time, in 1691, we had the Virginia slave codes, and that created white versus Negroes. Then in the 1700s, we had the priest, sorry, I'm having some trouble with some words. We have the Jesuit clerics and caciques. We have royal courts fused with churches. They also have the 1700s, the scientific revolution. All those tools came up. Gee, where'd they get all those from, right? And they had whiteness was linked to civilization, religion, and progress. poor Europeans gradually folded into the white category, and the purpose was religion and science fused to justify colonization. Whiteness becomes the badge of superiority. And I have to hand it to them. I think this white trick is one of their better tricks that they cooked up. So hats off to you, Psychopath. You win the white trick award. Okay, so then we have the 1800s, the Industrial Baron. During the Industrial Baron era, they wore top hats, tailcoats, and they were the robber barons. Of course, they rolled out the photography and the telegraph and the railroads. The white Negro label fades, and then we enter the Italians, the Irish, the Jews began slowly entry into the white zone. The Civil War resets, and photos show only dead bodies, erasing diversity. Because there weren't probably enough white people in those Civil War photos was the reason they claimed they couldn't take pictures of them, right? So then later in the 1800s, we have the uniform mask, we have the generals, the police, the FBI, the agents, and the mafia in suits. So yeah, it has gone down. And also in the 1920s, they changed their entire attire. Remember, they went from fez hats and turbans to business suits. So yes, this has been very interesting in compiling all this into one piece now that we know more, right? Because, in Turkey they banned the old look and enforced Western suits. Then in the 1930s, we had the other mask. We had the people in the Vegas casinos and all that. We had the nuclear tech and television. So yeah, and whiteness was here again from the 30s on, marketed globally as Western freedom versus dark others. So yeah, and the mafia in Hollywood, they did they distracted populations while eugenics was renamed into genetics. So it's been just one constant trick. So it's pretty interesting to see them all laid out, and I'd encourage you to go look over further at my website. I have them all detailed out over there. Because these are the patterns across all these layers. The masks they wore were visible costumes like royal robes, business suits, and now they're wearing hoodies. The tech rollout, they always claim it's new inventions staged as breakthrough, like printing, electricity, nuclear, AI. The whiteness invention, that equals racial caste system, weaponized for colonization and division. And each reset synchronizes in three: costume, invention, and race hierarchy. Other tech rollouts. Printing press wasn't really invented, but it was actually staged for control of scripture and narrative. Electricity, radio, nuclear, internet, and AI were all released decades or centuries after the Klan already had it in their vaults. Every release is wrapped in a costume exchange, royals to priests, to generals, to businessmen, to tech bros. Just like they do with stock markets, they do pump and dump narratives. They inflate illusions and then walk away with a profit. And here's some examples. Theranos, fake medical breakthrough, billions in hype, nothing real. FTX, crypto savior narrative, collapsed overnight, money laundered. WeWork, reinventing office space, another Stanford Silicon Valley scam. Yeah, like we didn't have office space, right? We didn't know what offices were until Silicon Valley came along and helped us. These aren't accidents, they're ritual frauds. Public is dazzled, money is extracted, myth collapses, but the Gypsy clan moves on untouched. And they use Stanford as a scam factory. Stanford is rooted in eugenics money. Leland Stanford came from robber baron wealth. Today, Stanford is the hub for AI hype cycles, biotech miracle cures, often fraudulent or recycled, crypto finance scams backed by elite venture capitalists. Students and genius founders are just actors. The institution supplies the narrative and the funding. Why? It's the same pattern as firebombs and nuclear. Firebomb equals real destruction. Nuclear is fake, new science or a myth. electrification was the real hidden weapon. Theranos, FTX, and Stanford scams equals the same script applied to finance and tech. Each time, dazzle, extract, collapse, disappear. So let's take a look at some of these dates of the Romanov dynasty. It began in 1630. Interesting time frame, right? Mikhail Romanov became the Tsar of Russia, founding the dynasty after it was called the Time of Troubles. Alexander I's place. He was the grandson of Catherine the Great, Catherine II, and became emperor in 1801 after the assassination of his father, Tsar Paul I. So the Romanovs was not a new family line because the Romanovs were already well-established rulers of Russia for more than 160 years at the time Alexander was born, or so they say. I personally believe the history probably picked up around the 1610 time. And what I found out too, what sometimes confuses people is the late 1700s under Catherine and then Alexander. The Romanovs became more connected, here's a key point, to European dynasties, especially through marriages with German houses. Keep that in mind, okay? This can make it seem like a new family line was starting. No, I think that what it was, they say, is the continuation of the Romanovs with deeper European bloodlines. No, it was likely the Romanovs were all cooked up over there in Russia, and they spread out into Europe from that point. Because in 1613, after the Time of Troubles, which was a civil war, a famine, of course, and foreign intervention in Russia, a National Assembly elected Mikhail Romanov as Tsar. This restored stability, and the Romanovs began their dynasty, which ruled until the 1917 revolution. And what else do we have? Remember, we have Sabate Zevi. That dude came around in 1666. In the mid-1600s, the Jewish mystic Sabate Zevi proclaimed himself the Messiah. By 1666, he had gathered tens of thousands of followers across Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and beyond. The year 1666 carried huge apocryphal weight. So many thought it would usher in a Messianic age. When Zevi converted to Islam under Ottoman pressure in 1666, it shocked followers, but a secret Messianic act, the saboteurs, continued underground with long-term influence in Europe and the Near East. So why is this curious? Well, the Romanov dynasty consolidated in Russia in 1613 and set up a stabilized Eastern Christian empire. At the same time, Western Europe was experiencing massive upheavals from the Reformation fallout and the 30 Years' War. By 1666, Zevi's messianic movement added another layer, blending mysticism, messianic expectation, and hidden sects. Some researchers link the saboteurs and later Frankists in the 1700s to wider currents of radical religious reform, secret societies, and financial influence happening in the same century the Romanovs were cementing imperial rule. So my theory was this: the Romanovs grabbed power around this time. They set up the royal houses, dressed in fine apparel, rode in coaches, and took over as royalty. Some of their clan dressed as priests. They eventually moved into and took over Israel after the USA. They took over the USA around the Gilded Age. There were Muslims living in USA in those big homes. They did not build those big homes. The Muslims who built them did. Those Muslims did not include electricity in the homes because they knew the dangers of electricity on our electrical bodies. Many things happened around the Gilded Age, and when they took over: San Francisco earthquake, Galveston. So Romanovs rose in 1613 after Russia's civil chaos called the Time of Troubles. Gee, I wonder who got that started. By the 1700s, under Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, they weren't just rulers. They started dressing like Western aristocracy, building palaces, riding in imported coaches, copying Versailles and Vienna. Many Romanov relatives, cousins, and dependents married into or established other European royal houses, creating a web of royalty that looked traditional but was really fairly new. Some branches put on priestly robes: the Orthodox, the Catholics, even Protestant networks, so the same bloodlines could dominate both secular crowns and sacred altars. Shift to the USA, the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, 1870 to 1900s, was when robber barons, railroads, and big estates appeared. And they were talking to me. They said, my theory is that the outer story was Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, but the inner story was the royal clerical clans repositioned themselves in America under new names. Big mansions like in Newport, Rhode Island, or along Fifth Avenue carried old world palatial styles. So I suggest the Muslims were already there. They were builders with old world technology, and they constructed those large homes without electricity because they understood human bioelectricity and dangers of wiring. Later, when electricity was pushed through, it became part of the control grid against the rest of us. Cataclysms as cover events: San Francisco earthquake in 1906 and Galveston hurricane 1900 were two of the most devastating disasters in U.S. history. Both events erased large swaths of urban culture and architecture, conveniently opening the door for new building styles, new elites, and new technologies. After these disasters, reconstruction often meant repopulation and reshaping the narrative of who built what. Israel after World War II. The founding in 1948 of Israel followed U.S. and U.K. backing. And clans that once wore Romanov crowns or European robes had moved into financial, political, and clerical posts, setting the stage for the new Holy Land project. The Romanovs themselves were supposedly executed in 1918, but their bloodline and network may have survived in new disguises: bankers, priests, and democratic leaders. These are some of the patterns. A family sect gains power: the Romanovs. They multiply across Europe, cloaked as royalty, priests, and nobles. By 1800 to 1900s, they relocate power centers to America, called the New Rome. And remember, that was what New York was called, right? Catastrophic events, earthquake, wars, depression, act as reset moments. By the 20th century, they positioned to establish Israel with U.S. backing. So here again, I have that all in a nice little tidy timeline down for you to take a look at. So let's reel it back. And some of these patterns were royal masks. Romanovs as rulers, later embedded in European nobility. They wore priestly masks, clan members posing as clerks, theologians, rabbis, and Jesuits. They wore builder-settler masks, U.S. Gilded Age estates as a stage set for takeover. Disaster resets, quakes, and hurricanes erase inconvenient architecture and people. So, the final shift from Russia to Europe to U.S. to Israel. So let's track these clan of these gypsies a little closer. The Romani gypsies entered Eastern Europe and I think they have obviously messed with all these years, but I think they've done it in several ways. One is when they call things like new Gothic, or this is Gothic from this period. I think it's because they did that to keep from confusing themselves, because they had databases to sort out this stuff. Okay, we're going to write the Bible, so let's give a quote that says this thing. Let's give another quote that says that thing. And if you keep in mind, these two sides always also create a lot of conflict and different things like that. So, anyway, the Romani gypsies, they entered Eastern Europe between the 14th and 16th century, migrating from the Indian subcontinent via Persia and the Ottoman lands. They were persecuted, enslaved, and censored. What do I always say? The way you really can tell a psychopath is when they are in fact screaming they're the victim, while in fact they are victimizing everybody else. So this victim thing they developed with the gypsies, they just carried it over with the Jews. So according to them, they were persecuted, enslaved, and censored across Europe. It's starting to sound like a lot of people on social media. They're censoring me now. They're shadow banning me now, as they're sitting there with millions of followers, right? So even today, the word gypsy is taboo in many academic sources. That censorship itself is suspicious, almost like history is hiding their true role, because I went around and I tried to write certain things on different search engines and stuff, right? I checked out a couple different the AI models and stuff. Nobody, nobody, not even Yandex. Yandex is who I use mainly for my search tools. Yandex, they have a new AI over there. They would not touch the conversation about gypsies with a 10-foot pole. So I have this theory that the Romanovs were not really ancient Russian nobility at all, but a Romani gypsy clan that seized opportunity during the time of troubles, that key point in Russia. Their adaptability, they're changing their names, their costumes, their professions. They were musicians, traders, smiths, priests, soldiers, would have allowed them to shift into royalty once they had the right opening. If the Romani clans took the throne in 1613, they could then put on royal robes and be legitimate rulers. They could put on priestly robes and become Orthodox, Catholic, or even Islamic scholars. This chameleon behavior fits how gypsy Romanis were portrayed in folklore: hidden, deceptive, everywhere and nowhere. The USA before the Gilded Age was Muslim and more symbolism. I said in a past show, I'm 100% convinced that my father, who was raised in Kansas, was in fact Muslim. I'm also convinced that I will be someday soon, but I also am Muslim. I looked exactly like these Muslim kids. I had the red hair, which you see in Muslim communities. It's odd, but it happened. And the hazel eyes. Yeah, I look just like those Muslim kids. But anyway, so the symbolism is all over this place, and of course they had to get rid of it. The architecture, the domes, the horseshoe arches appear in 18th and 19th century buildings, often written off as Moorish revival or Orientalist. Fraternal orders. And I've done shows about everything I'm talking about today, so I'm unfortunately not going to be able to give you links to all of it, but hey, I've got, if you get confused, I've got a lot more information than I've already done work on. So if some of these little details you didn't catch when I did the show about the Shriners or something, I've already got a show about it. But anyway, so they set up these fraternal orders. Remember, the Shriners wearing those fez hats. That was founded in 1870. They wore fez hats. They used that crescent symbol. Overt Islamic symbolism. This was before the robber barons consolidated things. Yes, and remember when they took over the Middle East, what was it, under Sykes-Picot, 1906 or 20, somewhere in that time frame, they redesigned all of the flags. So that's when all the flags there, and that star and that crescent moon are actually pagan symbols. So, yeah, they started in this country with the Shriners, 1870, and those fez hats. Then they had the Masonic lodges. The Masonic temple tradition borrows heavily from Solomon's temple, Arab Islamic geometry, and Moorish decorative arts. So I think the pre-Gilded Age builders were Muslim-informed craftsmen tied to the older Islamic world. So by the late 1800s, robber barons plus Romanov-style clans seized the estates, rewrote the narrative, and electrified the houses against earlier builders' wisdom against human bioelectricity. They rebranded the Islamic Moorish symbolism as decorative or exotic, erasing the memory of Muslims, Moors, or Gypsy Muslim builders, or Gypsy Moorish builders that had actually designed most of it. Why the censorship today? Search engines downplay Gypsy history. Romani contributors to architecture, science, and religion are almost erased. Meanwhile, the official line is that they were nomads, thieves, outcasts. This fits with a pattern of erasing an inconvenient group that may have once been powerful. So this is my framework. Romanovs equal a Romani gypsy clan that climbed into royalty. USA equals already filled with Muslim Moorish gypsy symbols and architecture before the robber baron era. Gilded Age equals takeover plus narrative rewrite, electricity, finance, robber barons, and just the new masks they put on. Because remember also we had the shift in 1906 where they tricked the snake on the medical logo, added the second snake. That's another date to think about. Symbolism insertion across the USA. Islamic Moorish symbols, crescents, stars, domes, arches appear in architecture and fraternal groups like the Shriners and the Masons. Serpent symbols, snakes, dragons, twin spirals appear in medicine, finance, and military insignia. The saturation of symbols happens before or during the Golden Age takeover, seeding the culture for control. Post-Gilded Age disasters. After the clan secured wealth and infrastructure, railroads, banks, electricity, and big estate, the reset phase begins. And they started out in 1900. Galveston hurricane wiped out America's leading port city. 1906, San Francisco earthquake destroyed most of the city along with its old architecture. 1929, stock market crash wiped out independent wealth, consolidating financial control. Dust Bowl of 1930s drove massive migration, breaking traditional farming families. World War I and World War II, two wars reset Europe. America emerged as dominant, paving the way for Israel in 1948. Each event conveniently erased populations, property, or competing powers while leaving the clan stronger. So here's the pattern. Phase 1, 1600s to 1700s, the Romanov Gypsy clan rises, cloaked in royal robes and priestly garments. Phase 2, 1800s, the clan moves power base into the United States, claiming Muslim Moorish-built estates and rewriting the original history. Phase 3, 1900s, symbols shift, snakes, crescent domes, and engineered disasters like quakes, crashes, wars allow repeated resets. Phase 4, mid-1900s onward, The Klan consolidates financial, military, and spiritual control, launching the Israel Project with U.S. backing. And this is what some of their migration of these clans did. The late 1800s, early 1900s, huge migration from Russia, Poland, and Eastern Europe into the U.S., New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. They mixed with ordinary migrants were clan networks, some already involved in smuggling, racketeering, or border tricks back in Europe. These families adapted quickly in America. They shifted from Romani-style travel dress and tricks into urban rackets and organized crime. Prohibition as a great opening, 1920 to 1933. The U.S. government bans alcohol. This creates a black market worth billions overnight. Mafia families, often with Russian, Polish, Jewish, Italian networks, seize the opportunity. The official story focuses on Italians, Capone, Luciano, Genovese, but Russian, Polish mafias like Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Arnold Rothstein were equally crucial. Many of these figures had roots in Eastern European ghettos, exactly the same regions that my theory that ties the saboteur people from. So prohibition cash wasn't just street-level crime. It seeded the early casino industry, Wall Street laundering, and political influence. That Arnold Rothstein guy, born to Polish-Jewish parents, financed much of the organized crime in New York and also fixed the 1919 World Series. Meyer Lansky, born in Belarus, then Russian Empire, became the mob's accountant, connecting U.S. mafia to offshore banks. These weren't random gangs. They became shadow financiers of America's expansion. Tricks, symbols, and control. Just like the Romanovs dressed as royalty, the mafia dressed as businessmen, but their true power was control of hidden economies. Prohibition acted as a mass initiation ritual, teaching America that law itself could be twisted, markets engineered, and entire industries run by shadow clans. Once alcohol was legalized again, the mafia didn't vanish. They pivoted to casinos, narcotics, labor unions, Hollywood, and politics. So the pattern continues. The Romanovs, 1613, wearing those royal robes. The Gilded Age, 1870, they had mansions, estates, and railroads. Prohibition, 1920s, they had mafia networks, secret banking, and street power. Post-World War II, 1948 onward, Israel founded, mafia deeply tied into CIA Cold War covert apps. So I asked this question. The mafia takeover was not separate. It was the next mask that they wore. A clan that once posed as royalty and priests now posed as criminals and businessmen, using tricks, black markets, and disasters to build a shadow empire. And I'll give you a couple of examples of these mobsters. Arnold Rothstein, he lived 1882 to 1928, born in New York to Polish Jewish parents. He was called the Brain. He was a financier who showed everyone how to turn organized crime into a business. He famously fixed the 1919 World Series. It was called the Black Sox Scandal. Rothstein mentored both Italians, Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, and Russian Jews, Meyer Lewinsky and Bugsy Siegel. So the bridge between old world clan tricks and new world mafia empires. Let's look at Meyer Lansky, born in what was Russia, now Belarus. Childhood friend and lifelong partner of Bugsy Siegel. Known as the mob's accountant, he set up offshore banking, laundering, and casino operation. He co-founded the National Crime Syndicate with Luciano. Later helps establish Las Vegas with Bugsy Siegel. It shows how the Russian Eastern European mobsters were not just foot soldiers, but financial brains of the actual mafia. And I have one more here, old Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy Siegel, 1906 to 1947, born Benjamin Siegelbaum to Jewish immigrants from Ukraine. Street muscle in New York, co-founder of Murder Inc. with Lansky. Pioneered Las Vegas with the Flamingo Hotel, mixing mafia money with Hollywood glamour. Tied directly into both Jewish mobsters and Italian bosses. So here's how they merged. What happened was Lucky Luciano was Italian. They merged with Meyer Lansky, who was a Russian Jew, and they formed the National Crime Syndicate in the 1930s. It was a multi-ethnic cartel. Italians, Jews, Irish, even some Poles and Russians. Italians handled the street authority, and that was the 5 families. And remember, 5 is their number for Saturn. So the families in New York were Italian, and they were called the 5 families, okay? But the Russian Jews handled the finance and global expansion, the casinos, the narcotics, and the offshore banks. This was the true mafia takeover of America, not Italian alone, but a fusion of old world clans under new American rules. The Russian Eastern Europe mobsters weren't just gangsters, they were descendants of the same clans that once played the roles of the Romanovs, priests, and gypsies. Their role in America was to embed in the underworld, merge with Italians, and control the black markets, alcohol, gambling, and drugs. Once again, the outer mask was mafia crime families, but the inner continuity was the clan survival strategy. Royal, the priest, robber baron, mafia, banker, politician. So I have all this down below. I find it, I find it very interesting, or I really wouldn't be bothered, and quite something that I meant to mention. I sounded like I was doing a lot of complaining yesterday, which I'm really not, but I have the ability to complain, okay? I haven't lost that ability. But I just decided that I can't run around here all grumbly and stuff because I have the cats to deal with. I don't want them to pick up on my energy. And really, I just got to write it out, right? Because we're here on this game board. What the hell am I going to do, right? And so we came here with a mission, and I'll be damned if I'm going to leave before that mission is done. I don't care how they try to kill me or move me off the game board. It doesn't matter. I am here. This is the problem. They never bothered to understand who we are. They could have picked a person like me out a mile away if they'd been paying attention. They should have known. When I was working in Silicon Valley and decided to sue Intel, I was willing to stop my consulting business where I was my billing rate was $120 an hour. I knew by suing Intel my life was going to drastically change, and I was so furious by the nerve of what they did that I proceeded along no matter what they tried to do. They tried every trick in the book. I had to go through several attorneys. I went from a billing rate of $120 an hour in my consulting business, shut all that down. I ended up scrambling around looking for temporary work. I started out finding work for $10 an hour. Yeah, I became ostracized and fighting for my life. It took years. And during that whole illustrious time, they put me on all these pills. So I don't really know how I navigated it all. But I have been a fairly determined person during this entire ride to figure out who these people are. Because it was back then, back there, I knew that we were surrounded by psychopaths. I just had this feeling that I never could shake, and what I wanted to know was who are the ones sitting amongst us, because all they kept trying to point me back to was the criminals. And I kept saying, they can't have locked them all up. They got to have some of them out here. And that's been their biggest deception. They wanted to hide what a psychopath is. Actually, a pretty smart move on their part, because anyway, so enough of that. So let me keep reading here because I only have limited time this morning. So So what they did was the Italians, with Luciano Castello and the Genovese, they provided the muscle, the street control, and political influence, whereas the Russians, the Eastern Europeans, which were Rothstein, Lansky, and Siegel, they provided the finance, vision, and international connections. Together, they created the National Crime Syndicate in the 1930s, which became America's first true multi-ethnic organizational crime cartel. Now, shouldn't we be proud of ourselves for this? I mean, really. America is such a great country, right? Criminals, murder. So, anyway, this fits my theory because these mobsters were not random. They were clan descendants from Russia, Poland, Ukraine, and Italy, carrying forward the trickster survivor strategies of the same networks that once posed as royalty, priests, and merchants. Prohibition gave them the cover event, like earthquakes and crashes before, to step into power openly. After Prohibition, they did not disappear. They embedded into casinos, Hollywood, unions, banks, politics, and global finance. So really, it's really a two-masked strategy is how I am seeing it, okay? They have the same networks playing both criminal and law enforcement. So whatever way history turns, they remain in control. And that was the case of that Osage Nation story that I talked about years ago. And I'll be talking about that here in a second, just briefly. But so they wear the two masks. One mask is a criminal, and one mask is the lawman. The mafia side, they have bootlegging, racketeering, gambling, assassinations, and the outlaw mask. Under law enforcement, they have FBI, police chiefs, judges, politicians, the protection mask. By placing their people in both roles, the Klan created a rigged system, one hand which makes the crime, and the other hand makes the solution. J. Edgar Hoover is the perfect example. And remember, too, he was also a black guy. And he got into a lot of trouble. And that black story about his family was a crazy one because he threatened to murder some of his old relatives if they came forward and confessed to black people on that side of his family. So J. Edgar Hoover is the perfect symbol, head of the FBI for 48 years. He publicly battled organized crime, yet countless researchers argue he shielded certain syndicate figures and steered investigations selectively. Then, of course, we have the Osage Nation murders in 1920. After oil was discovered on Osage lands in Oklahoma, the Osage became incredibly wealthy, one of the richest groups per capita in the entire world. They were systematically exploited. White guardians appointed over Osage finances. Local businessmen and settlers manipulated the system. Dozens of Osage were murdered, killed by gunshot, poison, fire, or stage accidents between 1921 to 1926. These were not random acts. They were planned exterminations to inherit the oil rights. But the FBI's role was this. The Osage murders were one of the FBI's first big cases. Officially, the Bureau solved it and brought some culprits to justice. But the hidden outcome, only a few minor figures were punished. The bigger network behind the killings was untouched in the end. Most Osage families lost their oil wealth through murder, legal guardianship theft, or swindling. They used fire and poison, seemed to be consistent tools for these events. We had the fire at the San Francisco earthquake, mysterious house fires, the Osage murders. Fire erases evidence. And I'll be getting back to many more fires when it comes to this child experimentation thing. Big fires going on there too. So both tools allow for mass reset without clear accountability. So it's called the manipulation formula. Create or explore a crisis. Play both sides. Control the narrative. And the result is this. Victims lose their wealth, land, or autonomy. The Klan gains assets, and the public trusts the rescuers. the Osage case as a symbol of the pattern. Just like the Romanovs with the priests and robber barons and mafia and bankers, the Osage case shows the same clan inserting itself into every angle. The outlaw killers, the men who poisoned and burned Osage people. The lawmen were Hoover's FBIs who were resolving the murders while protecting deeper networks. The final result, Osage wealth transferred out, tribe left shattered. So the Osage case is not just a tragic local story, it's a microcosm of the global method. Whoever controls both crime and law controls the entire outcome. And I have a bunch of crisis events. I put them all down below. It's interesting when you start to look at all these things, and you gotta wonder, gee, how did we miss all this stuff, right? So anyway, some of the same clan once ran mafia rackets or wore FBI badges. They also put on uniforms covered in medals. They rise as generals, admirals, and decorated heroes, presenting themselves as defenders of the nation. In reality, their role is to lead wars that open money pipelines for defense contractors, financiers, and land grabbers. Then we have the corporate mask. Companies act patriotic, waving the flag, running ads about supporting the troops. Behind the scenes, they charge 1,000% markups on weapons, supplies, even food and fuel. So, overbilling the government for uniforms, boots, fuel, aircraft parts, building weapons factories with taxpayer money, then keeping the profits private. Cost plus contracts, where the money they spend, the more they profit. War becomes the biggest guaranteed business on the planet. War allows mass killings to be presented as duty. Not only does this eliminate enemies abroad, but it is also a way to thin out the domestic population they secretly despise. Poor, working class, immigrant, and rural. Soldiers sent overseas come home broken or don't come home at all. Meanwhile, the elite class remains untouched. Their sons often given officer or intelligence posts instead of trenches. The land grab mask. After war, the spoils are just overseas oil fields or colonies. They are also domestic resets. Farmers who go bankrupt while sons are away get their land foreclosed. Urban destruction, riots, and disasters bring neighborhoods bought cheaper by developers. Native tribes like the Osage, Sioux, Navajo, etc., they get further dispossessed through legal tricks, fraud, and outright force. The cycle of war profiteering. They create the war or amplify a crisis, put on medals, act patriotic, kill off populations, take the land and resources, and reset the symbols. So the pattern is criminals, laymen, military heroes, corporate patriots. Each mask hides the same outcome: profits, population reduction, land seizure. And I have all the things down below about all the crazy things they do in these wars and all the massive amounts of deaths and money and all of that. It's pretty, well, that's why I love doing timelines and I love looking at pictures, because it is actually pretty horrifying when you take a look at it. So, the Gypsy clan as rollout managers, not inventors. They did not create electricity, photography, or railroads. They released these technologies at controlled moments, pretending they were invented at that time. Like a vault keeper, they had access to old world tech and staged its introduction when it served their control system. That's why inventions seem to appear in bursts: printing, photography, electricity, radio, always during moments of reset, wars, disasters, or Gilded Age. Civil War as a reset, not civil. The name Civil War suggests an internal, almost polite conflict, but it was the opposite: brother against brother slaughter. In your lens, it wasn't about slavery versus union. It was about clan consolidating control over the continent. destroying one half of the population, wiping out competing aristocracies, handing massive contracts to railroad, banks, and suppliers, resetting land ownership across the United States. Photography as controlled disclosure. The official story, photography was new around the 1840s to 1860s because bulky equipment prevented action shots. The result, Civil War photos are mostly of bodies, aftermath, corpses in piles. My point is this, that was deliberate. If photos had captured real-time battle and populations, they might have shown truths we weren't meant to see. Like, were those bodies in those piles really black bodies? Or they'd pile up the few white people they could pile up and take pictures of, right? Different demographics, darker skin tones, evidence of who really lived in these towns before the reset, signs of advanced tech already in use. By restricting photography to post-mortem images, they cemented a narrative of chaos and death instead of everyday reality. Americans were far more diverse than later photographers and paintings suggest. Native Americans, freed Africans, Creoles, Melungeons, Romani travelers, even Moorish-descended groups were widespread. What if action photos were avoided because they would have shown troops, workers, and citizens with darker skin as a majority, not the pale, aristocratic faces the Klan wanted in the history books? By staging aftermath photos only, they erased the real racial makeup of the 19th century America. The Golden Age as a great rewrite. After the Civil War, the U.S. entered the Gilded Age, 1870 to 1900. This was when mansions and robber barons appeared. Electricity and photography were branded as new. Immigration surged, but who was really already here that got erased? Architecture with Islamic Moorish motifs were covered up or demolished in disasters, San Francisco earthquake, Galveston. It says, in my framework, the Civil War plus Gilded Age equal the Great Takeover event where the Gypsy Clan cemented control, rewrote racial and technological history, and rolled out new, old technology to dazzle the public. So that, in my opinion, is exactly how it happened. And I have some extensive timelines down here for you to take a look at because nobody likes a good timeline better than I do. So we have the patterns. We had the royal houses. We had the churches. We had the Habsburgs over there in the Vatican. So yeah, the rollout always coincides with a population reset. The new technology reshaped society. So yeah, the Bible printing and all of that. Why printing around 1600s was key. Before mass printing, knowledge was handwritten or oral. Communication was limited, meaning the Klan could easily twist reality. Suddenly, the Bible, edited, canonized, and approved, is printed in the millions. This coincides with the Catholic Habsburg consolidation of Europe and the Romanov rise in Russia. It was a weapon rollout for narrative control. So, fake space, CGI, and real infrastructure. NASA and them show people cartoonish satellites beaming signals to Earth. The reality, global internet has always run on undersea cables, first laid in the mid-1800s. By the 1900s, telegraph, telephone, fiber optics, all underwater cable grids. Satellites are mostly symbolic to make the public believe in a high-tech sky religion. The Klan prefers visible idols like rockets, CGI Earths, while the true grid is hidden under the oceans. Universities as eugenics factories. Stanford University, 1885, founded by Leland and Jane Stanford, deeply tied to eugenics, improving the race and better breeding. Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and University of Chicago, all ran eugenics programs in the late 1800s to early 1900s, often with Rockefeller Carnegie funding. Oxford and Cambridge in the UK fed imperial civil service and eugenics societies. Eugenics was a respectable mask for the same old clan obsession, controlling population, deciding who reproduces, sterilizing or erasing undesirables. Today's Silicon Valley's geniuses, I say that mildly, Stanford is ground zero for eugenics. Cold War tech projects like DARPA funding, MIT and Harvard military contracts, genetic engineering. These are the new priesthoods, but they're just wearing hoodies. They look rebellious, but they sit in the same chairs as the old eugenicists and Jesuit-trained engineers. Their obsession with AI, gene editing, transhuman is just a digital rebrand of eugenics. And here again, I have another timeline that plays it all out for you. So, the lie engine: roll out old technology when society is destabilized, control the narrative through universities, media, and now CGI and NASA and Hollywood. Mask in eugenics language, first by improving the race, now transhumanism. Recruit the new priesthood, scientists, engineers, tech bros, mostly churned out by Stanford and other eugenics-rooted schools. Keep the public ignorant. Make them think satellites beam the internet. Electricity is progress. AI is new when it's all staged and controlled. And remember, right after the Gilded Age came the progressive movement. Everybody seems to skip on past this, and now we have the Democrats calling themselves progressive. I would be careful of what I called myself, because history books say the progressive era was about cleaning up corruption, improving working conditions, expanding democracy. Key figures: Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, the reformers, and the suffragists. The outer story was this: safer food, antitrust laws, child labor restrictions, votes for women. At the very same time, the real backbone of the progressive agenda was eugenics and social engineering. 1890 to 1910, eugenics societies founded in U.S. and Canada, often by elites tied to royal families, robber barons, and universities. 1907, Indiana passes the first compulsory sterilization law in the entire world. By 1920s, more than 30 U.S. states had sterilization laws. Universities, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, all of them ran eugenics programs or funded them. The Supreme Court in Buck versus Bell, 1927, they upheld sterilization with the phrase, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So they use a two-mask trick. They use a progressive reform. We care about the workers, women, and children. We are modernizing America. But the other mask is the eugenics control. We will sterilize, classify, and manage populations like livestock. Same people behind both masks. Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson both openly supported eugenics. Many suffragists and reformers did also. The progressive environment era created the infrastructure for modern population control. Universities as social engineering labs, state and federal sterilization boards, census and data collection to classify races and families. Immigration restrictions, 1924 Immigration Act, targeting Southern, Eastern Europe, Asians, etc. It was not a side project. Eugenics was the core engine of progress. The progressive era ended around the 1920s to 30s, but the eugenic structures were absorbed into public health, genetics, and later tech. Stanford, with its eugenic founders, becomes ground zero for Silicon Valley. Harvard and Yale eugenicists became Cold War policymakers. What was once called eugenics is now called transhumanism, gene editing, AI human integration. So here again, I have a whole list of things that compare these different, and also we'll give you all the acts. So if you ever want to look further, you get a lot faster if you know what the acts are. So yeah, let me see, I might go over this. Yeah, progressive era to the Nazi era to post-war genetics, and this is 1930 to 1959. So yeah, still cranking on the old eugenics. Germany had the law for the prevention of hereditary disease offspring passed in Nazi Germany. Nuremberg laws. This is interesting about Nuremberg laws because really it wasn't a real trial, right? but during the Nuremberg laws, they had racial hierarchy. Eugenicists maintained exchanges with German race hygienicists. So, yeah. Anyway, so I'm not going to be able to read all of this, but I've got it all. If you want to take a look, you could take my data right now and probably write a 300-page book out of it all. So, the label eugenics becomes unacceptable after 1945. And remember also, genocide only became a word after the Nuremberg trials. So the label eugenics becomes unacceptable after 1945, but the methods and infrastructures remain the same. They just largely rebranded the whole thing. This has been nothing more than a rinse and repeat. And here again, I have a whole timeline of when all of these eugenics things have been taking place. I love reading things, and I love writing these reports because it really focuses my attention into areas that I might have missed before. It's tiny little things you'll pick up on. So before we had the whiteness, in medieval, early modern Europe, people weren't called white. They were English, Irish, French, Polish, Moor, Jew, Gypsy, Tartar, etc. The term white Negro shows up in the 17th to 18th century to describe groups considered poor, degraded, or non-elite Europeans. The Irish, the Italians, the Eastern Europeans. They weren't just yet fully white. Race lines were fluid. Skin tone was noticed but not for the core identity. Religion, class, or clan mattered more. So yeah, they essentially, I did a whole show about this white business, and that, like I said, kudos to them. They should get the Psychopathic War of the Year for this deal because by the 1970s to 1980s, white became the badge of superiority used by colonizers across the Americas, Africa, and Asia. By the 1800s, science, eugenics, cements white as a superior race category. So really, when you peel back the cover of all this, it's a pretty simple trick, isn't it? So when Britain and France and later the U.S. went to partition Africa and the Middle East during the Berlin Conference or the Sykes-Picot, whiteness was their master key. A handful of officers in khaki or navy uniforms could dominate millions. Maps drawn by white experts cut through tribal ethnic lands without negotiation. White becomes shorthand for divine right plus modern technology. The Klan knew this. By creating whiteness, they created a visual caste system that worked wherever they went. So the whiteness as a eugenics weapon. Once white was invented, it merged seamlessly with eugenic logic in the progressive area. The idea of protecting the white race justified sterilization, immigration quotas, apartheid systems. White wasn't a skin tone, it was a political technology. Poor Irish, Italians, and Jews gradually folded into whiteness when convenient. Gypsies, blacks, natives, Asians kept outside, labeled unfit. So this was the real trick. By inventing whiteness, the Klan divided the world. Colonies, whiteness equals power over the land. Homeland, whiteness equals hierarchy, but also a carrot for poor Europeans. At least you're white. Global partition, Africa, Middle East, India, carved up with scientific race maps. It was the single greatest power move because it gave the illusion that millions of colonizers shared power, when in reality it was the royal eugenic elite pulling the strings. So in this framework, pre-1600s, no white people, only nations, tribes, and clans. 1600 to 1700, white invented legally to control colonies. 1800s, white becomes weaponized through eugenics and colonial uniform power. 1900, partition of Africa, Middle East, India, justified by white supremacy. Today, whiteness still used as a social wedge throughout the clan itself transcends color. They hide behind it. They know they're imposters. They weren't ancient monarchs, inventors, or civilizations. They were opportunists. They're the Gypsy clan who seized thrones, churches, and universities. Whiteness was their best camouflage. It erased real diversity, history, and advanced older societies. If people saw through it, the scam would collapse. Attacks on people of color aren't just random prejudice, they're psychological projection. They hate the image of themselves reflected back. The nomadic, darker, rootless, impoverished visions. To hide that, they overperform whiteness with uniforms, medals, powdered wigs, pale portraits, whitewash history. They destroy and demean people of color because deep down they fear these populations resent the truth of who they were before the mask. And here again, I put together another timeline which will lay out all the white people. So they attack people of color for this simple reason. It's called projection. They fear being seen as what they really are, which is mixed, nomadic imposters. So they attack others. Erasure. By destroying or demonizing darker skinned groups, they erase living reminders of advanced societies that existed before their takeover. Control. Racial division guarantees people fight each other, not the imposters in crowns, pulpits, or boardrooms. So, yeah, I don't know. It seems to be coming pretty clear to me, so I'm hoping that I'm able to explain it to you, because it just seems to follow these very significant patterns. So, because what they did was they pulled in the 5 Italian families. They're called the 5 families. That's the Bonanos, the Colombos, Gambinos, Genovese, and Luccheses. Okay, they became the formal commission of Italian mob power. But they coordinated with the Chicago group. So the mob was never really just all Italian, okay? Chicago is remembered for Al Capone, who was Italian, but the city's rackets were not controlled by Italians alone. There's a man named Gus Russo, R-U-S-S-O. I've been reading his book, and it's just beyond phenomenal. This guy really put in the work. And this is how he actually influenced me in this whole thing, because when I started reading his book, he talked about in Chicago, it was settled with the Ashkenazi mobsters. And I thought, okay. So yeah, so Chicago was a completely different thing. And Chicago, what Gus Russo said, Russo emphasizes that Chicago's underworld was heavily Ashkenazi at the top. The outfit, they call it, was portrayed as Italian, but its money managers, accountants, and wire service owners were Jewish. This mirrored what happened nationally. Italians ran the face of the mob, but the Jewish Ashkenazi networks, mainly from Russia, Poland, Ukraine, controlled finances and later merged into legitimate businesses. And that's why this big rush to get all that money into Ukraine, right? Because that's where their Khazar mafia is, and hopefully I'll be getting back to that soon. So the Italians were the visible mask. The Ashkenazi networks, the hidden mask. The Ashkenazis did the money, the banking, the media, and the political connections. By letting the Italians carry the gangster image, the Ashkenazi financiers could move seamlessly into casinos, Hollywood, publishing, and later Silicon Valley finance without the stigma. The Chicago case is especially important because it shows the Klan's continuity from Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, to American organized crime, to a legitimate corporate financial empires. So it really was set up with the 5 families who were Italian Sicilian in New York. So I've got all of their names, everything you want to know about them down below, in a nice and handy little timeline list. So the New York, the Italians were visible. The Jews, Ashkenazis, were embedded as indispensable partners in finance and expansion. In Chicago, the Italians were the loud faces. They were Capone and Nitti, but Ashkenazis like Guzis and Annenberg quietly controlled the money pipelines, gambling, and national wire service. In both cases, the mafia image, Italians with fedora hats and Tommy guns, was a mask that distracts from the real power, the financial networks which link back to Eastern Europe and eventually merged into corporate America. And I also pulled up the entire mafia structure, New York versus Chicago into Vegas and Hollywood, and that is all there for you to take a look at. You really have a lot of stuff to take a look at, and I also did a thing about how they connected with the unions and all that. It is, I tell you, I hope you'll take a look at it because I happen to find this very interesting. So, yeah, 1920s to 40s, we had the Italian muscle and the Ashkenazis building the finances. 40s to 60s, they had Vegas, Hollywood, muscle, money, and culture. 70s to 80s, Wall Street finance absorbs mob profits, corporate fronts legitimize it. 1990s to 2000s, media conglomerates, tech startups become new laundering vehicles. And remember, I've been saying for years, that was exactly the time of the last John Gotti trial that they started Silicon Valley. I went to work in Silicon Valley, I think it was 1978. I was living in Southern California, and I was hired by Intel, and they relocated me to Northern California. I did not know what Silicon Valley was, okay? I was working in an advertising company, and we were all going to leave the company because we worked for this dismal boss. And so one of my other department managers said, "Hey, Diane, have you ever thought about moving to Northern California?" I said, "Sure, I think about it." And that's how I got the job. They handed me the reference. I sent in my resume, did a couple of interviews, and I landed the job. And they moved me. But at that time, I didn't know what Silicon Valley was. Nobody did. So, yeah, and right at that time, 70s to 80s, Wall Street finance absorbs the mob profits. 1990s to 2000s, media conglomeration, tech startups becoming new laundering vehicles. Today, Silicon Valley plus Wall Street are the legitimate heirs of mob dynasties, still rooted in Eastern European, Romanov, Habsburg, eugenics networks. The Klan constantly changes costumes from gangster, casino operator, movie mogul, banker, tech bro. Each mask conceals the same agenda: control population, control money, control the story. By the 2000s, they don't need fedoras or casinos anymore. They're now owning data centers, AI labs, and streaming platforms. And here's where the trick got kicked into gear. For centuries, Ottomans and their extended elites in the Middle East or North Africa wore fez hats, turbans, and kaftans. These were markers of Islamic culture, continuity, and a different civilization identity than Europe. The fez hat, which is, of course, my favorite topic. You know, I've become kind of a little expert on hats, so I have to brag here a little bit because I first unleashed a lot of this when I figured out that the Santa and Pope were wearing the same hat. So I always pay attention to those hats. So those were markers of Islamic culture continuity. The fez, especially, this simple red fez cap became the most visible badge of Ottoman identity. Because after World War II, I did a show about this. After World War I, the Ottoman collapse, they did what was called the 1925 hat law, and they banned the fez hat, and they replaced it with Western business suits and fedoras. Every time I see a mobster in a fedora, I just have to start laughing. So why the costume change? Well, it wasn't for fashion. It was a symbolic submission to the Western clan order. Business suits equal European uniform of legitimacy. They ditched the turbans and the fezzes and erased centuries of Islamic continuity. So, yeah, they got rid of the fez hat. So, the Ottoman, the Turkish Republic, the fez was banned. Business suits were enforced. In Rome, the Renaissance royals, togas were gone, powdered wigs and robes were in. In America, post-Civil War, diverse populations were erased. Gilded Age, they wore top hats, which were really a fez hat with a brim. They wore tailcoats. They wore corporate uniforms. Matter of fact, I saw somebody from the royal family, I think it was Prince William, wearing a top hat the other day in a photo. They like those hats. They like those symbols. So, but today we have hoodies, jeans, Silicon Valley casual, the current uniform mask. Each makeover is a way to erase the memory of who they really were and adopt a costume aligned with a new ruling system. Because when Ataturk banned the fez hat, it wasn't just modernization, it was killing a symbol of old knowledge and independence, replacing it with the same mask the royals, bankers, and mafias had been using, the Western business suit. This put Turkey, the old Ottoman seat, under the same costume regime as Europe, Wall Street, and later Silicon Valley. And yes, another thing, so you got to watch this ChatGPT, because I had a ChatGPT, months ago, and it kept denying this. And I'm looking at a picture, the Romanovs, I keep seeing the Romanovs wearing that Iron Cross. I've talked about that Iron Cross so much, I feel like I'm moving into a repeat session. But anyway, so I found a better way to get an answer out of this Iron Cross thing, and really simple it. The Romanovs wearing the Iron Cross is another clue that shows they weren't just Russian royals. They were deeply intermarried within the German houses, the Hohenzollern's, the Habsburgs, the Saxe-Coburg, and later the Windsors. That's why Tsar Nicholas II and Kaiser Wilhelm II looked like twins. They were cousins, but wearing each other's medals. Medals were masks. Masks, I'm having trouble with the word mask, M-A-S-K. Anyway, these royals often wore fancy orders like the Iron Cross, the British Order of the Garter, as part of projecting legitimacy. It gave the illusion of a family of nations, but in reality, it was one big interbred clan that swapped uniforms at will. The Iron Cross itself was introduced in Prussia in 1813, revived by Kaiser Wilhelm I and II, then by Hitler, was a symbol of militarized Christian Europe. The Romanovs wearing it showed their alignment with the same imperial order, not some independent Russian identity. The Romanovs weren't native Russian dynasts, they were imposters plugged into the broader European clan. Wearing the Iron Cross was like putting on a military mask of whiteness and Christian imperialism. The models were part of the same costume game. These symbols distracted people from the fact that the same network was behind both sides of the war. And of course, the big ball, I'm going to close out the big ball of nuclear. I'm going to close out with this firebombing versus nuclear bomb narrative. Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, Kobe, etc. The U.S. firebombed. And go back and read history yourself. You will hear them constantly talking about firebombing. They're not talking about nuclear. So the U.S. firebombed Japanese cities relentlessly, 1944 to 45. Napalm and incendiaries burned hundreds of thousands alive. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, always presented as nuclear bombing, but the historical record is blurry. Even survivors describe firestorms very similar to Tokyo. The official line, nuclear equals divisive, firebomb equals background. The hidden line, the nuclear story was a cover, but the real devastation was mostly firebombing. So, because the U.S. testing before the war, they had the Desert Southwest Trinity test in 1945, which was officially called the first. But photos, film, and even accounts suggest testing was staged and imagery had already been produced earlier. Lookout Mountain Laboratory in Laurel Canyon, Hollywood was a secret military film studio 1947 onward. It was dedicated to producing all of the nuclear test films and propaganda reels. Most of these we associate with nuclear explosions were studio products or composites. The nuclear bomb was narrative provided shock and awe. It made the U.S. as sole superpower, godlike destruction ability. Justification for military budgets, Cold War arms race, trillions funneled into nuclear programs. Psychological terror, children drilled with duck and cover populations controlled by fear. And in a future show, I'm going to play that clip. It's very it's campy, like, right. You could look at it now and think, oh, this is pretty funny. But then you think through the eyes of a young child, and the words are saying it's really pretty chilling. But anyway, I'm about ready to close. Let me keep going. Dirty electricity as silent eugenics. Post-World War II, the U.S. and allies rapidly electrified every home with alternating current, transformers, wiring, and meters. Nuclear fear distracted from the real war. Our bodies put into EMF cages. Atoms for Peace programs weren't about giving people nuclear plants. They were about normalizing the idea that invisible radiation equals progress. This created cover for the silent eugenics war. Long-term exposure to dirty electronics, EMF, radiation. Slow attrition of health, cancers, sterility, neurological damage. No smoking guns, just progress. Patterns once again. Firebombing was real, the visible horror. Nuclear bomb was a mythic weapon created with staged media. Electrification grids were the true deployment of radiation into everyday life. And I have one last timeline for you to look at, because remember I did that show called the Black Wall Street. There was an area in Oklahoma where black people were actually surviving and doing quite well. Well, that from what I have been able to tell was the first firebombing incident on U.S. soil, because it was a prosperous area and people there described the smell of kerosene. So I believe very much that in 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and that Black Wall Street was indeed firebombed. So there's a lot, because I've been into this firebombing for a long time, so I did another timeline of it all. And like I said, I love timelines because it really helps put things into perspective. So, because firebombing equals real, repeated tools of erasure. The nuclear bomb is a cinematic mask filmed by Lookout Mountain, sold as apoplectic fear. Electrification grids, the true silent development, turning homes into radiation cages, the next phase of eugenics. And let's not forget where they came from. Norfolk, England was a key departure for the Pilgrims and others who didn't make the voyage but stayed connected. Leiden, Netherlands, University City became the hiding organization ground. Some hopped on the Mayflower in 1620 into Plymouth colony. Those who stayed behind in Amsterdam and Leiden formed the roots of finance, printing, and trafficking networks. Amsterdam equals long-standing hub of shipping, banking, and vice. By the 1600s, it was a center of global trade. Dutch East India Company, slave trade, printing press. Today, Amsterdam still carries that reputation. Porn capital of Europe, sex trafficking corridor, drug pipelines. So, what else connects to that? Well, Norfolk, Virginia, colony, it was named deliberately. They named Norfolk, Virginia themselves, right? I didn't name it. I don't think you named it. So, Norfolk, Virginia was a colony named deliberately after Norfolk, UK, their old power base. Norfolk, Virginia became a naval hub, the Norfolk Naval Base, the world's largest. Later, CIA, intel presence tied deeply to the Norfolk-Langley corridor in Virginia. Norfolk as a naming ritual, their first beachhead in America. Then we have Norfolk, Nebraska, where I'm currently recording from, the town of terror, the town of electrical surges. Norfolk, Nebraska. Why such a random small town? Why carry the Norfolk name? Possible coven markers used to set up hidden outposts away from scrutiny. Yeah, this is considered a flyover state. Nobody would think to be looking around here. I'm telling you, nobody would be. Nebraska equals the rail hub, meatpacking, trafficking corridors, the Chicago-Denver line. Could be their Midwest route. Echo of Norfolk Coven carried inland. Why this matters? The names are not coincidences. Norfolk, Virginia, Norfolk, UK, Norfolk, Nebraska. Ritual renaming, a way of staking territory. Amsterdam as the vice route is centuries old, not just modern red light district. So the Leiden, Amsterdam, Pilgrim, Plymouth was not about freedom. It was about seeding their colonies with cover stories and religious liberty as their mask. When you trace their footsteps, the trail becomes clear. They started in Norfolk, England, moved through Amsterdam and Leiden. Then some boarded the Mayflower, but the real story is those left behind. Amsterdam became the hub of porn, trafficking, and banking, the pipeline into Brussels and into Europe. Then they carried the name Norfolk to America, Norfolk, Virginia, today the naval hub, intelligence corridor, and CIA's shadow harbor. And Norfolk, Nebraska, another Coven marker hidden in the Midwest along the trafficking rail lines. These aren't random names on a map. They are breadcrumbs of a clan that has marked its territory from the very start, through crowns, through ships, through cities. So today we've traced their mask tonight, from crowns and robes to medals and uniforms, from business suits to tech bro hoodies. The Romanov Gypsies never disappeared. They changed their clothes. They re-rolled old technologies. They staged firestorms and built myths around nuclear bombs. And now their deadliest weapon isn't in the sky, but in our homes. Dirty electricity. The silent eugenics that was designed to destroy our very own DNA. The betrayal stretches from Tulsa to Tokyo, from Wall Street to Stanford, from the Civil War to Silicon Valley. Different costumes, different stories, the very same killers. The question left is this: do we keep living under their illusion, or do we finally rip off their mask? This was the Romanov silent war, fear, and the nuclear myth. Thank you for joining me. Every crown, every medal, every suit is just a costume hiding the same killers. Be safe out there, and goodbye for now.